Right. Okay. So today, what we are looking at doing is basically covering the last learning outcome, of this particular unit, which is sustainable logistics management. Now, so far, if you have to do a quick recap, what we've done is in learning outcome one, we've covered pretty much, the concept and theories around the sustainable development and logistics. So we've differentiated key concepts like the, sustainability in supply chain, sustainability in logistics, and then arrived at a concept of sustainable logistics management. In this, we looked at, the key things which is related to the 5R model. We looked at different types of inbound and outbound logistics, how the differentiation happens, what are the advantages, disadvantages. And then we also looked at the concept of third-party, logistics providers and differentiated that from 4PL. We've also looked at briefly now the origins of the concept of 5PL, which is fifth-party logistic providers. In the second learning outcome, we have detailed out things which are related to, reverse logistics. So when we talk about logistics, it is 4 different processes. And then in these 4 processes, some of them are termed also as forward logistics, FL, and some of the processes are termed as RL, which is reverse logistics. So in detail, we covered the concept of reverse logistics, which is primarily when the products, goods or services are originating from the customer and are going back to the manufacturer or the supplier. So in this case, we looked at some of the challenges of return management and, the 3 R's in particular, which are related with inside the 5R model, which are related to essentially repairs, return, and recycling. And those are the challenges that we look at when most of these, companies that we discuss, taking the example of Amazon in particular, when you look at gig economy in question, we generally see that the process of return logistics has become important for many companies in many sectors, across the globe. And there is a lot of value which the business can recover by following the process of reverse logistics. So some of the studies which are being conducted, especially by the Aberdeen, study group, which did a research over a number of years to understand the process of how reverse logistics can be applied across which sectors, they came about with the statistics that between 9 to 15% of value can actually be recovered, which is called the residual value from the products which are sold by the companies to consumers by following the process of reverse logistics. Then we also looked at, not in great detail on the PowerPoint, but at least 2 case studies that are available on Moodle, which is to understand the case of reverse logistics in particular. And one such case study was the electronics industry in Thailand, and the other one is the automotive industry, which is from a point of view of how reverse logistics in that case typically tends to happen. So these 2 case studies are listed here, which were obviously, from a point of view of also addressing the assessment criteria 2.3, wherein it is talking about studying the impact of reverse logistics in different sectors. So different sectors would mean at least 2. And from these 2, electronics and automotive, if you read these case studies, it will help you in understanding how these companies operating within those environments have actually implemented the process of reverse logistics in terms of recovering value, helping build profit line or bottom line for the businesses, and also in terms of reducing, the following the concept and the principles of sustainable development. Now, the third learning outcome is primarily focused on understanding some of the other components which come in the whole process of company strategy following sustainable logistics management or sustainable development, as we discussed in the first learning outcome. So here we are going to be focused on understanding things which are related to greenhouse gas emissions. We are going to be looking at carbon footprint. We are also looking at the concept of the 3 R's in particular, which is reuse, reducing of the waste going to, the industries or the sectors sending waste to landfills, and then finally the concept of recycling. Now, the first 2 assessment criteria of this outcome tend to be purely theoretical, and we'll have to look at taking a practical examples to understand what are the different measures through which you can, which companies can actually reduce the carbon footprint. But because it is talking about it very generically, we are going to try and relate it to logistics in particular, because we are studying the concept of, greenhouse gas emissions and, reducing carbon footprint from a point of view of logistics and supply chain management. The third assessment criteria is what we're going to be focused on to understand, how companies, organizations can to try and reduce the carbon footprint from a supply chain perspective, because essentially, again, as I said, we need to be looking at, understanding this particular process of, supply chain management and sustainable development from a point of view of supply chain management. So let me start off by covering some of the key terminology, in question that we talk about in particular for Learning Outcome 3. So as always, what I've done is compiled a few questions. So when we talk about, the environmental impact of warehousing, packaging, transportation, in general, logistics, movement of goods, warehousing, storage, inventory management, we talk about the impact on the environment in the form of the greenhouse gas emissions which happen. So some of the questions which come to my mind, and I'm sure that they will come to your mind as well, that this particular term that we get to hear quite often, which is greenhouse gases, what does this term actually comprise of? What are the various types of greenhouse gases? So when we talk about the various type of greenhouse gases, we are looking at understanding, the greenhouse gases, which are gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, which is normally which is the most polluting greenhouse gas at this moment, nitrous oxide, which comes out from emissions, vehicles and some of the other related, industrial equipment that we use. And then some of these greenhouse gases, which also look at when we talk about chlorofluorocarbons, which are UCFCs, as we call them, which the use of which was actually banned sometime in the 1990s. Is still continuing in terms of usage, in some of the things that we use, like creamers. You look at refrigerators and, things like that. Some of them, they still have the, chlorofluorocarbons, which affect the ozone layer of the earth. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, and if somebody is to ask you what are greenhouse gases, what are the different types of, greenhouse gases, the common ones that we are aware of are carbon monoxide, which gets released from the vehicles, methane, which is from agriculture, cattle industry in particular, agricultural farming, beef industry in particular is the largest producer of methane. And when we talk about other gases which affect the ozone layer, we're talking and essentially referring to something called chlorofluorocarbons, which is going to affect the ozone layer. Now, the other question which comes to our mind when we talk about, okay, I know about the greenhouse gases now, but what is the effect of these greenhouse gases? Why do they have a detrimental effect on our environment and our climate and our atmosphere? So here, most of these greenhouse gases actually contribute to increasing temperature. So when the Earth's atmosphere warms up, it leads to rise in temperature, and this then leads to more precipitation, unpredictable weather cycles, more of rainfall in certain regions, and obviously, as we get to hear in the news, that it is leading to the more use of these emissions of these greenhouse gases is leading to global warming. The average temperature over the last century has increased by 1.5 degrees centigrade, which has meant that the water levels in terms of ocean, because of heating and global warming, has risen by up to 3 feet. So when we talk about greenhouse gases, they are causing global warming. This global warming is leading to melting of glaciers or ice in certain regions, which is releasing fresh water into the oceans, and that release of water into the ocean is causing the ocean levels to rise, which poses threat to low-lying areas or islands wherein they are just at sea level. So the Environmental Protection Agency is, and along with the Paris Climate Accord, which happened in 2018, which America has signed out of, is all looked at from a point of view of reducing the emission of these greenhouse gases and its effect in terms of increase of temperature, global warming, rise of the sea level, things like that, is the reason why, there's a lot of focus on studying and understanding what is causing greenhouse gases emission, how they can be reduced, and how can we reduce the environmental impact of these, activities which leads to the production of greenhouse gases. Now, there are lots of terminologies around this, but generally to understand, there is one terminology which has become quite synonymous with greenhouse gases, and that is called the greenhouse effect. Now, this is generally defined as warming of the climate that results in the atmosphere trapping heat radiating from Earth towards the space. So I think some of us who have studied biology, or at least a bit of this related to in our schools, what we do understand is that during the course of the day, when the sun radiates heat and we get the warmth from the sun, the Earth's atmosphere actually which encompasses the Earth actually takes away all the harmful radiation which comes from the sun. But during the night, when this heat escapes into the atmosphere and goes out, this leads to obviously the cooling effect, of in terms of the temperatures dropping during the course of the night. But because of the emission of greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, methane in particular, and carbon dioxide, which is also emitted by phytoplanktons in the ocean. This is my biology actually now talking, which I've studied 25 years back. But we also look at, trees which emit carbon dioxide in the night. And that is why it is recommended that you should not be sleeping under the trees during the night, because the trees emit carbon dioxide during the night and they emit oxygen by absorbing carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis in chlorophenol or something, which I'm forgetting. So they do the process of photosynthesis and emit oxygen during the course of the day. So these gases, nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, methane. Yes, Anna.
I'm sorry, I was saying chlorophyll.
Chlorophyll, yeah, that's the word, chlorophyll, yeah. So these, gases actually trap the heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and because of which, if the heat is not able to escape, then it leads to the process of, warming up, and that effect is called the greenhouse effect. So there are lots of these terms. Some part of this is to understand and apply this within the logistics and supply chain, but because we're going to be talking about greenhouse gases and its effect and how this can be controlled by businesses, that's why some of these terms are captured in the key terminology. Now, climate change, we get to hear this every day, pretty much in the news, in the papers, or any particular article, magazine that you read. There's a lot of focus on people doing their individual bit, companies being asked to do their individual bit by helping to reduce, global warming. And this is all primarily related to what is happening in on the Earth in terms of its atmosphere, which is the climate change. That means, in general, the temperatures are rising, which is leading to melting of ice, rising sea levels, and obviously extreme weather, which some places in general are experiencing. Now, there are lots of bodies which are formed around this, which are basically monitoring and obviously from a point of view of creating legislation around it. And that is being primarily done in the case of, businesses, which, so that is primarily being done, I would say, in the case of, for businesses to comply with, because they are seen to be one of the major contributors of, release of these greenhouse gases, which leads to global warming and, a detrimental impact on the environment. Now, there are, various bodies, but obviously because the indicative content does not ask us to cover, so we look at some of the UN bodies in particular. We look at, the Environmental Protection Agency. We look at certain charities like Greenpeace and others, which are basically actively working with companies with different types of sectors within different sectors to be able to reduce this particular, concept, work on this particular concept of what is global warming and trying to reduce the impact on the environment. Now, in the first assessment criteria, what we want to be able to do is understand some of the measures through which businesses in particular can reduce the amount of greenhouse gas which is released and the waste which is generated by businesses in the activities that they do from time to time. Now, what I've done is, in order to cover this learning outcome, I've created some questions, and then in order to understand what are the strategies which the companies can actually employ to reduce have been discussed in different slides. Now, let's look at understanding the basic concept of what is waste. So we've understood greenhouse gas. We know in this particular assessment criteria, at least the definition of greenhouse gas, what are the different types of greenhouse gases, why they are produced, how they are harmful, and how they are contributing towards an impact on the environment, which is primarily for through climate change. Now let's understand what is waste and waste management. So waste, if we look at a traditional definition, there are different types of waste. So household waste could also be there. You could look at business and business activities producing a number of different types of waste. So let's concentrate on waste which is generated by business. Now, first is when we look at waste in general, we talk about, some of the raw material resources which a business uses, which are inefficiently utilized or are not completely utilized, and that creates a bit of a waste. A simple example that I would give you here, not related to, say, the logistics in particular, but when we look at fishing in general as an industry or fisheries as an industry, you would generally see that when large companies, basically look at this process of processing, say, fish into canned products, what tends to happen is they generate a lot of waste. And that tends to happen because only a part of a certain, the fishes is used for in terms of, the material which is becoming edible, and rest of it actually generates waste. So some part of this, some, production facilities like in the UK, when we look at Seamark, which is one of the largest, exporters of fish and fish-related products, especially in canned, what they do is rather than disposing them off, that basically send across to the agriculture industry or as bird feed, and that basically ensures that any sort of waste which is generated is actually being utilized by some of the other ancillary industries in which it helps to minimize anything going to the landfill. So waste in general, when we define, is the, if a business is looking at doing some activity and it is not able to utilize the fullest of the raw material and it still generates a certain amount of waste, that will be called general waste. So unwanted material which could be left over from production processes or some sort of material which is discarded because it cannot be utilized in the production process would essentially be the second type of waste. And the third would be looking at the material that does not add value to the customer. That means you've ordered something and that's something which has not met your requirements. So in the case, sticking to an example here of food, you bought some sort of an item from the wholesaler or from the retailer, and you find that the item is faulty. So in most cases, food items or anything related to grocery cannot be returned, recycled. They have to, they can't be resold. So they have to go into a landfill or, they have to be discarded away. So in this case, any material which is returned by the customer, which does not have any reusable value and cannot be resold, recycled, or any value which cannot be recovered would be the third kind of waste which a business would produce. Now, having classified waste into three different types: inefficient use, unwanted material which gets produced because of the production or manufacturing process, and something which leads from returns and has no way of either repairing or recovering any residual value in terms of reusage, would be the third kind of waste. Now, sometimes when you look at waste generated from business, we also classify them as commercial waste, and they are then also classified on different types of classification. So when it comes from construction industry, we'll call it industrial waste, which is coming from construction. So when we look at waste coming in from different sectors, depending on which sector is contributing how much of waste towards the environment in terms of the material being discarded, some of these sectors contribute higher percentage going into the environment, into landfills or waste for waste collection, as against some of the other sectors. So in some cases, the wastes are classified into two types. One is under business, we would classify them as commercial or industrial. Now, commercial example would be, say, for example, we look at a construction firm, which is basically a small construction firm, but in this case, the small construction firm essentially is looking at, say, they do some extensions or, they do some small projects of building and management, in this case, and any waste which gets generated from that, say, for example, a repair of a house or something they are doing, then it generates a certain amount of waste, and that waste would be a commercial waste. But if that waste is to be generated at an industrial level, so if I look at an example of a developer who's developing a housing society or a development which has 300, 500, 400 houses or skyscrapers, the amount of waste the site, the production site or the the construction site would actually produce, but because of its scale, it is producing a very high volume of waste that will be classed as industrial waste. So when we look at certain companies, which are global companies now, companies like Veridor, they have recycling facilities in different cities in the developed world and also in the developing countries. What they do is they classify and allow the waste to be disposed of depending on the category or the sector from which the waste is coming from. So if we look at to visually show you, if I look at an example of this company which I've talked about, Veridor, they are a big French firm which are present in the US, in most European countries. And when they look at the concept of waste management, they look at recycling waste at different levels. So there is waste that they can collect from home. There is waste they can, which is classified as commercial waste. And then there is waste which is classified as, industrial waste. When we look at recycling and they look at, doing this at a large scale, they basically further categorize this in order for them to be able to put the three principles of R's, or 3 R's as we call them, into practice. And that would be, reuse, recycling, and, essentially redeployment or redisposal to be able to create certain value. So they classify recycling under things like glass, compositing, material recycling, plastic, paper and cardboard, mixed electricals, under which there are some guidelines and legislation around it, metals and organic. So the idea of classification of this waste is so that the companies, when they dispose of the waste material, they are able to send it to a facility which has the ability to be able to kind of recycle it, reuse it, or redispose it in a way which is going to be safe for the environment. So sometimes when you look at industries like the automotive industry, they have a large, say for example, they produce lots of waste which is primarily metal. It could be waste which is related to oil in particular, and these types of waste have to be disposed of in a very systematic way so that they do not damage, say, the water table or, damage the environment in the long term. So when we have to look at that, some part of this, like metals, can go under recycling because they are sent across to scrap manufacturers, which basically sort, the scrap and then melt it and reuse it and bring it into the business again. And in some cases, some part of it which cannot be, reclaimed or reused, then has to be disposed of under, say, if it's a hazardous substance, or for example, it's a such substance or a waste which takes years to degrade or, to recycle, then in this case, there have to be proper facilities to be able to dispose that of. So plastics is one such example wherein industrial plastic takes about 1,000 years to degrade in the environment if it is sent to a landfill. But because it is such a long time frame in which this can happen, the companies are then expected to send this to recycling facilities wherein it can be recycled in a much more efficient manner, wherein the time to recycle that waste then allows this to be brought back into production and reuse, which means that you are sending less and less of it to landfills for it to environmentally degrade and then go back into, the process of, go back into the environment. So waste management, waste disposal is something that we need to understand and do a clear classification of before we go into understanding, what are the different measures through which business can actually dispose this waste and what are the kind of waste they generate. So as long as you understand that the waste can be generated by 3 different types of activities, they can be classified into 3 different types. We are going to be focused more on, not the household, but commercial and industrial waste here. And then when the waste is disposed of, why it needs to be disposed of, because of the legislation in place in a proper manner, and that requires, appropriate facilities to be able to recycle, repair, or redispose of that off, so that they have less detrimental effect on the environment. Now, because we are going to be studying what are the measures and why these measures have to be taken by businesses, one of the clear reasons which stands out is the reason that most companies today are looking at regaining certain value from recycling. That means that they are able to bring certain value into the business in terms of revenue if they are able to recycle and reuse some of the materials which are used in producing or selling their goods and services. So reducing waste not only saves money on costly waste hauling. That means if sometimes you see companies have to send off a lot of waste to a recycling facility, that requires transportation. So when we look at the concept of transportation here, they have to look at third-party providers or fourth-party providers wherein they come in, they collect the waste which is being generated, and then obviously send it to proper recycling or disposal facilities, and that is costing the company millions of dollars or millions of pounds across the years. In some companies, when you look at large operations like Unilever, Procter and Gamble, so the large FMCG companies or large retailers, you will look at a lot of money being spent on waste hauling. So here, in order to reduce the cost and save money at their own end, what they are looking at is in or around their distribution centers or warehouses, they are looking at creating now ways through which they can recycle, reuse or dispose of this waste rather than send it off to third-party companies wherein they will dispose it off for them. So it is in their benefit to look at this as a cost because their size of operation and the scale at which their operations is currently happening, they generate a lot of waste themselves, and having to reuse and bring this into some sort of a reuse if possible, if it is done in their facilities or closer to their facilities, ends up reducing costs and basically saves them money in the long run. Now, what are the various ways through which they can look at reducing this in terms of emission of greenhouse gases and waste management in general would be some of the bits that we look at that I've compiled. So one such example is composting. That means anything which is primarily an organic waste which can decompose in the environment is basically is going to use the process of decomposting or composting essentially. And here, when we look at retailers in general as an industry, so when we look at in the UK, the big four, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, and Morrison's, they generate a lot of food waste. And this food waste can be composited, by sending it to a landfill, which then can be reused, to essentially in different places, in gardening, in agriculture, in other industries, allows this to be, allows this as an activity to generate some revenue or revenue stream for the industry. So there are lots of ways in which, a lot of these companies would look at reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emission or waste generated by business by looking at one of the activities called compositing. The other would be when we look at most companies actually implementing this process of reducing waste or waste management, and then looking at, maybe incorporating something like under corporate social responsibility, sustainable development, or, the process of, reducing carbon emissions, carbon footprint, would then look at before even they make an, say for example, if it's a production facility or a production site or a construction site, before they look at this, they look at doing an audit, and this audit is done as a requirement, on a say for example on some sort of a frequency, yearly, 3 yearly, 5 yearly, and this is to ensure that they have taken adequate measures in place to be able to reduce the waste which is generated from some of the activities which is happening at that site. So an audit helps them understand gap areas in activities which are producing waste, and say for example, consultants who work within this particular industry then work with some of these manufacturers to look at how they can effectively reduce the production of this waste at each step of the production process, and that allows them to overall save costs. So some part of this is through the process of audit. A simple example that I would give you in this case would be when we look at say paper, usage of paper within businesses. you would generally see that most offices or large, small, medium businesses today, look at paper shredding because of documentation, data protection. And what they tend to do is this paper shredding, which is happening, is being collected in a particular location. There are signages which are put, and in some cases, there are some waste baskets which are created within the office and working environment to say that, okay, if you're looking at doing away with paper which is of not of any use, either shred it or put it in this bin or in this container. And that allows this particular side of waste which is being generated in the business, in an office, to be collected separately and then straight away sent for recycling, because as you know, paper can be recycled, and that allows the business to look at reducing waste which is going into a landfill. Now, this is primarily possible because some companies would look at the process of audit, and in this audit, they recognize that we go through so many rims of paper, or so many, there's a requirement of that much of paper in the year. And because if some part of this paper is recycled, needs to be disposed of because of data protection reasons, they would do an audit, and that audit would allow them to install some of these containers or bins, which would allow people to drop unused or used paper in those facilities. There are some other points like reduced packaging. So when we look at logistics in particular, when we look at the example of Amazon and in particular, and I mentioned this before, but just to reiterate here, sometimes if you're buying products online and you buy a number of products from the same retailer, but they have different delivery times, the retailer would give you an option to ship all the items together. If you're not asking for next day delivery or things like that, then in those cases, if you've ordered some items, then all of them are packaged. They might have their individual packing, but in order for them to be dispatched to you and delivered to you, the retailer, in this case, Amazon, would primarily package it in a box, and one box then would be delivered to you, as against different boxes and packaging coming in. So this helps retailers reduce packaging, which helps in reduction in terms of spending of money, or, multiple deliveries which can happen to a single customer if you've ordered, say, many items. In general, now most businesses are looking at reducing packing, and this is a specialist area wherein a lot of industry consultants are working with large companies, especially, again, the retailers, wherein some retailers in the European region have now said that they will use zero plastics by 2024, and that would mean that they need to reduce packaging or usage of plastic for packaging within any item which are displayed and sold in large retail stores. So some retailers have started now, instead of, say, for example, when you go to a retailer, you buy things on the shelf. For example, if you're buying some pulses, you have them in different quantities, like 500 gram, a kg, 2 kg. So what they're doing is they're having open containers in which what you could do is essentially, and have a weighing scale next to it. So what you could do is basically, if you're not looking at buying a kg or 2 kg and you want a smaller quantity, what they will do is basically ask you to bring your own, a container in which you can actually weigh the item and then pay for it accordingly. So Waitrose, for example, in the UK has started that concept wherein they've done away with the packaging, and they have some of these items available in open containers wherein you're allowed to bring your own containers in, like milk bottles and things like that, and then fill them up and pay for it while you're going, while you're tilling them out from the tills. One of the key things on which a lot of emphasis has been put, especially and in the businesses, is an example of a bottled water. Now, bottled water, there are 2 billion bottles of water or bottled water sold just in the UK, and there are 100 billion bottles which are practically shipped across the world every year. This number is rising. So in a lot of businesses, in order to reduce, say, plastic waste, businesses have now encouraged their staff and people to bring in their own bottles which can be used as sippers, and they can be essentially used primarily within the office or the environment in which they work, and they are asking and promoting the use of reuse rather than having to use bottled water. And then the last bit that we look at in terms of, there are lots of points, but we can look at some of them under recycling. So a lot of businesses are putting focus and emphasis on reducing and recycling paper and any sort of paper-related waste, which is cardboard used for packaging and stuff, glass, plastic, metals, batteries, construction waste. All these can be recycled, and brought back into the usage, into reuse essentially, if they are disposed of properly. And one such example which I showed earlier, say for example, when we look at recycling, as you can see, most of this comes under glass, compositing, material recycling, plastic, paper and cardboard, and then metals and organic. So this bit is a major initiative which helps in reducing carbon emission. If you have less waste going to landfill, less waste going for recycling, then it helps the businesses reduce their carbon footprint and also helps reduce, greenhouse gas emissions, because there is less energy or, let's say, process required to put that material into reuse, and which means that you're using less electricity or less water or other natural resources to be able to recycle that product, which means the companies are actually reducing to a certain extent their carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Any questions on this so far?
No.
Okay. Now, what we'll look at is also a particular concept wherein, when we talk about the second assessment criteria, here we are going to be talking about looking at ways in which businesses can actually use the concept of reusing, reducing and recycling, the 3 R's, and how this will help the business in general, reduce their emission of carbon, reduce their carbon emissions and reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. So the slides which are put together for this particular, assessment criteria are quite self-explanatory, but I'll quickly go through them. So when we look at the 3 R's, when we say reduce, what are we looking at reducing? We are looking at reducing the amount of waste which is generated by a business activity. So in this case, when we look at logistics and supply chain, there is a lot of waste which can be reduced, and this in particular in supply chain and logistics could be depending on the sectors that we take. So for example, if you look at just as an example of Amazon, going back to that again, and if multiple products have been ordered, how do you reduce the packaging waste? The packaging waste can be reduced by clubbing all the orders, clubbing it into one particular delivery, ensuring that the customer ordered products can actually be delivered efficiently through the last mile connectivity. In terms of when you look at most of the delivery which happens through third-party providers, these third-party providers are given some sort of a plan, a route plan, and because of the importance of technology which is integrated, which is vehicle management, for example, GPS trackers which are there. So the company or somebody in the background which is managing logistics and the flow of logistics and looking at transportation can actually look at, because all these vehicles are equipped with GPS trackers, and what they do is they do a bit of route planning to ensure that there is an efficient usage of fuel. They are using the shortest possible route to be able to deliver, and it follows a particular pattern in which they are not going back and forth, but they're essentially able to follow a very defined route plan, which helps in reduction of, say, consumption of fuel, wear and tear of the vehicle, saves in terms of time, and last but not the least, also makes the delivery also meets the delivery time frames. So when we look at reduction can be in terms of any sort of waste. So in this example which I've given, it could be in the form of reduction of fuel waste, which is greenhouse gas emissions, because the last mile, which is delivery happening, involves transportation of goods, and these transportation of goods to consumers, if they follow a particular plan which helps in reducing the overall mileage which the driver is actually covering, or the stops the driver is making to deliver the goods, would ensure that the delivery is done on time, it's effective, and it also reduces greenhouse gas emissions, which is coming primarily from the emissions in terms of the transportation. Is that okay? The second bit which I would look at would be reuse. Now, when we look at reuse, we are looking at, in this case, the concept of some of the products which can be disposed of, but can be reused in general in the process of business activities. So here, Going back to the example of where I took, the example of bottled water. So consumers or if workers within factories are, able to reuse, their bottles of bottled water, which allows in reduction of, say, the plastic bottles going to recycling or to landfills, would basically mean that, there is a concept wherein the business is able to introduce the concept of reusage, and which allows thereby, the carbon footprint to be reduced, because if it has to replace, bottles water, or provide bottled water to employees, the other way the company would do is they will install, stations through which water stations essentially, through which water can be, drinking water can be provided to workers, people working within the factories or within offices, and that would mean that they could eliminate the use of bottled water altogether. But that would be replaced by the 18 liters large water containers that we generally see in water filters. They also will need to be replaced at some stage, but that replacement recycle, becomes longer, and all of this then gets into reusage, because they can go back to the water manufacturer, which will refill these 18-liter large bottles, and then they can be brought back into the water filters or water containers, through which, it can be used for providing drinking water to employees, staff, and workers within factories. The third bit that we look at is primarily, recycling. So here, the emphasis primarily is on anything which cannot be reused, anything which cannot be, say, for example, reduced in terms of usage. The idea is to recycle it so that, any extractable value could be taken out from the product, and then it can be sent across to the landfill, or, the disposals to the waste management firms or landfills can be reduced, thereby, reducing the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, a typical example here would be to look at, if I say you have a faulty washing machine, or if you have a faulty product, at some stage the product will go back to the manufacturer. They will try and attempt to repair it, or replace a part and see if it works. If it still doesn't work or doesn't get repaired, at some stage what they will do is they will salvage whatever can be taken out from that for reusage. And beyond that, anything else like the metals and other bits would be then sent for recycling. Now, some part of it would end up in a smelting facility wherein they'll be melted down, different metals will go across and they'll go back into the system for reuse. But the recycling of those, or in terms of melting down of metals or other parts, would then still require natural resources to be used in order for them to become reusable. And that is where, again, the third-party, providers which are going to be using this as a process would use natural resources like electricity, coal, water, gas, other things, which will then lead to, greenhouse gas emissions, or, have a bit of a carbon footprint. So here, recycling tends to be the third and the last objective, wherein, the firms try and use reduce and reuse the products first. If they are not possible, then obviously they are sent across to recycling firms for them to be able to, manage it in a way wherein then they become reusable at some stage by doing certain activities or processes on it. So some of the companies, when they look at this process, in particular electronics now, which is one of the major contributors of, let's say, waste, which is coming out from industries, a lot of, manufacturers and, manufacturing firms which produce some sort of electronic goods or gadgets are actually re-looking at how they look at the process of, basically disposing of these electronic goods when they become faulty. So in most cases, you see a green colored recycle, icon or a logo, which is normally put on, the products, which is to say that this product can be actively recycled should you decide to do so. And there is a way that they would probably say that, you need to look at disposing this off. So when we look at this particular logo, what you do get to see is that obviously the earth has been put in the middle, which says save the environment, or this product is biodegradable. So this has led to the creation of, certain legislation which allows you to clearly understand that which product is recyclable, which product can be disposed of, is biodegradable. And in some cases, these are labels then which are put on to, the products, so that you can clearly identify that if this is something that you're looking at doing, this product can be recycled, or this product needs to be sent across to this particular facility, for disposing before you, before you actually do that. So there is a lot of legislation which has been created, and that legislation is now helping in the concept of recycling. And a lot of manufacturers, in particular the electronic manufacturers, gadget manufacturers, are being encouraged to put this label across on their packaging to ensure that when the customer disposes of the product, they know exactly what is recyclable, and some part of this can be then done in order to reduce the waste going to the landfill. Now, in order to better understand this particular, concept, there is a study which is called the circular economy, new or refurbished, which is called Circular Economy 3.0. There's an article which basically talks about how companies are realizing value in using the 3R concept and implementing that within their organizations and in their businesses. So this particular article is something that I've uploaded on Moodle. And if you read this particular article, it will help you in doing the assessment criteria 3.2, because it will give you some details about what are the concepts through which sectors are using, this in, the recycling concept, the reuse, and the concept of essentially, so reuse, reduce, and recycle within the sector. So here in this particular slide, put together a small table which essentially is from this article, and it talks about that a lot of companies, when they look at realizing value and or basically realizing some sort of a residual value from products, are looking at this particular concept of reduce, recycle, and reuse, and it is applied across sectors. So in some cases, when we look at downcycling, that means the producers are looking at, when you look at raw material, they are looking at remining, they are looking at recovering, recycling, or in terms of a strategy, looking at rethinking and developing a strategy which allows them to produce products which can be recycled and from which they can reduce or take out value. Then when we look at, a lot of manufacturers running schemes for, say, product upgrades, renewals, exchange programs, then in some cases, they are classified under the product upgrade side of the value retention, in terms of the concept. And what companies like Apple, they would do is, or Samsung would do is, that they would say, if you're looking at buying a new phone, upgrading to a new phone, you bring in your old one, we'll give you a residual value on that, and that value can be put across towards the new phone or new product that you're buying. So that would help them recover that material at a certain cost, which can be utilized in remanufacture, refurbishing, and selling it in some other countries wherein there is a price point and affordability for that product by cosmetic repairs. And this will allow them to still sell that product and gain some value out of it, even though you have done it or you've exchanged it for a newer product in a particular location or a geography. And the third would be from a client point of view, wherein as a customer, as a client, you're looking at reselling and reusing. That means you're also looking at getting some value out of it. So there are lots of companies which have come up which specialize in this concept of sell your stuff which you do not use. So there are lots of companies and lots of apps which are now available on because of the gig economy, wherein companies can actually send some, they can collect products from your home. They can pay you for your old DVDs, CDs, clothes, things like that, which is allowing you to recover some value. And in turn, they are reprocessing some of these to reuse these products to be able to sell off in other locations, wherein they are also able to realize money. So there's a business model around it. And this value retention business model, is something now being implemented by more and more companies. And this concept in this study, which has been done, is, this particular article of Circular Economy 3.0, basically looks at the concept of reuse, recycle, and essentially, reduce waste going to landfill. These two diagrams, which are taken up, from the same study, talk about showing you visually how the concept and where all the value is realized when the product is moving from one stage to the other. So when we look at basic stage, when the raw material is being mined, from where it gets into production, from there it gets into manufacturing. Finally, when the finished product goes to the retailer, from retailer to the consumer, and if it's being returned, it is collected, and then, or if it's being returned in exchange for an upgrade, it is collected and it goes to recycling, or say for example, if it cannot be recycled, reused, then it is going into landfill for disposing of. So at what stage, which particular part of the value chain is actually realizing value, that means making money, is actually shown in the flow of this particular diagram. So this talks about showing you the retention which at each stage businesses are able to do, and what they are able to process from a consumer and from a business point of view, to show you that there is value which the company or the consumer can realize if they look at the concept of reuse, basically reduce and recycle the products that they use in their day-to-day lives. Is it okay? Any questions on this?
No, it's clear.
Okay. Now the third bit which we are looking at in particular is to understand what are the ways through which business can actually reduce their carbon footprint when we look at global supply chain, or essentially supply chain. So here I put together a few reasons in terms of why businesses look at. So recapping some of the things that we've discussed, I think one of the clear reasons why businesses are now looking at reducing their carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions is because of the environmental sustainability clause within their corporate social responsibility, or their vision and mission. As companies' operations have become global, they produce a lot of goods, so there is some onus which is being put back on the companies because of legislation, government legislation, other legislations which are created by international bodies, which is asking businesses to look at reducing looking at focusing on this concept of reuse, reduce and recycle, in order to reduce their impact of in order to reduce their negative impact on the environment. Now, in order to do so, companies are also using technology to track, monitor, and reduce their carbon footprint. Now, how can this be done? There is a good exercise, just as a case point, which we can do, is look at carbon footprint calculator. So I was able to look at a website in which I can look at doing an example of how businesses would do this. And I would relate this to an example here, that if you're a senior executive or a person working within a business and you fly, you are in sales or marketing or engineering, production, whatever, and you have to, go across to different plants or manufacturing facilities, and you take flights. So one of the key things which the company is looking at doing is, if there is a workforce which actually travels quite a lot and they utilize different forms of transportation. So one such transportation could be, say, you being a senior executive, you go from one regional office to the other, or you go and attend trainings and things like that, for which you are taking flights. So one of the ways to understand is how much of a footprint does it create, how much carbon emission does it create when you take a flight from, say, one location to the other. So if I look at non-stop flight, just as an example, and I take, say, Manchester, if it brings up Manchester, so Manchester Airport, and I'm going from here to, say, Tokyo in Japan. So if I look at this, and I, as an individual, take a flight, and I take, say, for example, an economy class flight, it's a return flight, number of passengers, and you add it to the cart, it will give you a price to say that if you're looking at paying £15 and 7 pennies as an add-on cost, the company here would offset the carbon footprint for you, by doing something as an activity. Now, in some cases, it could be looking at planting trees, it could be looking at some sort of an activity which it could generate. So this is a good site, which clear-offset, which allows you to understand if you use a hotel, if you're using heating at home, if you're traveling by car, doing some activities which use environmental resources, then how much of, if you want to offset your carbon footprint or the emissions that you've done, you can actually utilize, certain sites like these, which basically in return for the money that you pay by offsetting your carbon footprint, do some activities to preserve or, return some of things to the environment. So when we look at the ways in which businesses can reduce today, their carbon footprint and greenhouse gas emissions, you will generally see some companies have tied up, on the manufacturing side, engineering side, production side, with certain companies in the developing world, wherein what they are doing is they are offsetting their carbon footprint by paying certain additional cost, and that is allowing them to do certain activities which, in a way, they say then after that is we are carbon neutral. That means whatever emissions they are producing, they are offsetting it by, doing some activities in other places which will kind of offset that negative of, what has been produced in a developed world. So this particular concept, have you come across this particular concept or heard about this?
No, I didn't hear about it. I just heard about it now, but I understood it.
Right. So basically, there are two terms which come about in this particular concept. One is carbon offset. So how do you offset the footprint of what greenhouse gas emissions that you have done? So this is done by offsetting, primarily through the route of compensation by some sort of additional payment or resources to a particular facility or a company, which will then do certain activities in return. So an example of this here would be if you're taking a flight and that flight from Manchester to Tokyo contributes, say, a certain amount of carbon gases emission, that can be offset by paying certain additional fees. And for that fees, the company would actually, do certain activities, could be plant a few trees or, some of the other things that they do. And that would say that though I've taken a flight and that is, because I've offset it by doing some activities to preserve the environment, that would essentially mean that you are being carbon neutral. So this is something that you try out, wherein you look at a particular country, room that you take, how many nights you start today, or for example, and it'll show you that, how much carbon footprint is being emitted, or, water that you're using, or the heat which is being used in the hotel, or the appliance electricity that you use, and how much can it cost in terms of money or your local currency to offset that by doing certain activities which will help preserve the environment. So mostly in these cases, it is primarily through creation of activities like planting of more trees, or, looking at, activities which will basically help preserve the environment. So those are the bits that, large companies today are doing when people or employees within their company are actually using certain facilities. And if they have to offset this, if they claim that they are carbon neutral, they are doing this by offsetting their carbon footprint by investing into, or in lieu paying some cost to companies which are then able to offset this by doing some activities to help save the environment or preserve the environment. Now, the other bits that we look at in terms of why businesses would look at, the whole process of reducing carbon footprint in terms of, making their supply chain more efficient, is by three different strategies. One is building allies and demonstrating value. Now, what that means is that companies now should understand in terms of their whole supply chain that what parts of their supply chain actually contribute the maximum, carbon footprint or greenhouse gas emissions. So in this case, if they can create a direct connection between the processes which are the most polluting or emitting most emissions with the kind of objectives and goals that they are able to achieve, they then can be internally realigned to ensure that some part of these activities produce less emissions and contribute less to the environment with regards to the value they are producing. And an example of this would be that if you look at Starbucks, for example. Now, Starbucks serves a lot of coffees and teas globally in the countries in which they are operating. So in order to look at building, value in terms of the reducing the harmful impact on the environment and sending less and less of those, containers to landfill, which is the, reusable glasses or things like that that you use when you get the coffee from a Starbucks outlet. What they are now doing is they are essentially working with their suppliers to produce recyclable coffee cups, which are disposable, which can be decomposed in a landfill, and they can be actively recycled. So the materials being used to produce those cups in which coffees and teas are served are being done in a way wherein it is more sustainable to the environment. Now, how is this happening? They're working very closely with their supply chain partners who basically supply the cups and the plastic caps. So sometimes now in a Starbucks, when you buy a coffee or a tea, they will ask you, do you need a lid? That lid is a plastic lid, but the glass container is a recyclable cardboard, which can be decomposted, and it is totally recyclable, and it doesn't harm the environment. But they definitely ask you, do you need the plastic lid? In McDonald's, if you see, the company has started to introduce a straw which is organic. So when you're taking a shake or when you buy a drink, the straws which are given are not plastic straws, but they are, organic straws. So these are ways in which companies are looking at demonstrating, long-term commitment to reducing their carbon footprint by working closely with their suppliers in the supply chain to ensure that they are able to use materials which are easily recyclable, and the materials which are primarily, even if they are disposed, can be reused and recycled without harming the environment. Is that okay?
Yes.
The second strategy which a lot of companies are employing is primarily looking at, setting targets. Now, these are set up as targets, as medium to long-term targets, which they are setting up, in their, say, for example, corporate strategy or the, long-term strategy for the company. So here, the companies are working with certain suppliers in their supply chain, wherein they feel that the maximum, emission of, carbon, say greenhouse gases is happening, or the processes which are in their supply chain, which basically do maximum emissions of, contribute towards what you call the emission of these gases. So here they want to specifically work with some consultants and these suppliers to put audits or quality checks in place so that they can help them over a period of time to improve those processes wherein these emissions can be reduced. So the audits do happen from time to time. They look at reporting of these audits. They see where the emissions are going up or going down. And then the idea is to bring consultants in to be able to create viable options or look at alternative options wherein these emissions could be reduced by conducting, and working with them regularly in order to make the whole supply chain more carbon neutral or, more efficient in terms of reducing the emissions. Is that okay?
Yes.
Now here is where I have an example of BMW's supply chain, which is what I would recommend for you to read as a strategy. Now, as an automotive manufacturer, they assemble the car essentially in their own plant, but the engines, the tires, the plastics, the body, the electrics, all of this is coming from over 1,700 different suppliers, which are a part of their supply chain. So BMW is committed to working with their supply chain and the suppliers in that supply chain in order for them to reduce the carbon gas emissions. This article is slightly old, but by 2016, they were saying that they will reduce the carbon dioxide emissions, up until 2020 by 50%. And this is something which is an example directly related to, what is this strategy which a lot of companies are now employing to work with their supply chain partners to reduce, carbon dioxide emissions or carbon gas emissions by 50%, 30%, whatever, depending on the company's strategy, but on a long-term basis. Is that okay? So
Yes.
this would give you some indication in terms of what strategies and what kind of strategies they're employing in terms of audits, reduction of basically the use of natural resources like water, electricity, which will help in the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions from their supplier factories. The third thing that we look at is primarily looking at greening the logistics supply chain. Now, this is where some part, whatever companies do, at some stage, they have to utilize transportation or logistics. Within logistics, this component of transportation to be able to deliver stuff from or transport their material from one location to the other. Now, this is where here the companies are looking at, as a sector, which is the second highest emitter of greenhouse gases worldwide. So if you look at BMW, which is manufactured in the plant, say in Germany, then the car is transported to 27 different countries for sales. Now, some part of this transportation of the car happens by road, on carriers. It happens through rail. It happens by ship, and this also is leading to usage of some sort of a resource, which is leading to contribution of greenhouse gas emissions, which is carbon dioxide or whatever it is. So in this case, the transportation is also contributing, of the finished product is also contributing towards the emission of greenhouse gas. So when we look at this is identified as the second highest emitter of greenhouse gases in the supply chain for any large manufacturing or a production facility or a company. So in this case, the manufacturers are working with companies which handle, when I say companies, that could be second party, third party, fourth party, fifth party logistic companies, in order to reduce any form of emissions. When I say any, means different forms depending on the mode of transport they are choosing, those side of emissions in their supply chain. And how they are doing this is by usage of, say, for example, in some cases, companies are offsetting it by downloading this responsibility to third-party logistics providers or fourth-party logistic providers. In some cases, you would see that they are reducing this by using the most optimal form of transport. So which could be rail transport, or which could be, say, for example, sea freight transport, rather than using, transportation by road. And in some cases, some companies like Volkswagen, I'm not sure if you've heard about this, but if you buy a Volkswagen car in Europe, what the car manufacturer does is, when you buy this car, it invites you to come and take the delivery of the car in its factory. So what it does is it will send you 2 air tickets with a stay at the hotel within the Volkswagen factory in Sweden, and you'll be able to test drive the car in their track and then take the delivery of the car by road. So this is something which they pay for in terms of your flight tickets and your stay in the hotel for 2 days while you take delivery of the Volkswagen car that you've chosen at one of their Swedish factories. So in a way, the customer, the manufacturer here is actually putting the onus of reducing emissions which could happen by transport, in particular by offsetting it with the customer taking delivery and then driving the car back to their country or to their destination. So this is a very unique scheme, and this applies to any Volkswagen, Volvo. Got confused. For Volvo, Swedish car company which basically manufactures vehicles. So here, in this case, if you're buying a Volvo within Europe, what they're going to do is essentially invite you, send you 2 tickets of the flight, 2-day stay hotel, for you to come in and take the delivery of the car through one of the Swedish cars. And this was them to all part of the missions done to transport the car from the customer. Okay.
Yes.
So you can put an example of Volvo. So if you study that particular example, that will give you, an idea of how they are looking at reducing or making sure that they are making that every part of the logistics, chain more green by reducing the carbon emission or, reduction of greenhouse gases. Now, obviously, towards the end, what we want to be able to look at is understand what is all this happening, helping us to do. So the way forward, which most companies are looking at in order to reduce their carbon footprint and also, greenhouse gas emissions, basically making their supply chain more green, they are looking at taking initiatives to reduce this by offsetting, carbon, say, footprint. They are looking at introducing processes which will allow them to, make the supply chain more greener. They are working with their suppliers. And also in some cases, if you see, Volvo has become the first car company which will phase out production of all diesel and petrol cars by 2024. A lot of the initiatives which are being taken globally, there was something which was published, I think, about 2 weeks back on the news, which basically said that the legislation is being looked at to introduce, wherein they would ask manufacturers to stop producing diesel and petrol cars in 13 years' time. So in this particular case, this is going to be, a legislation which will force the manufacturers to start looking at, an alternative, which is electric cars, in about 13 years' time. So in certain cases, when we look at, environmentally, personally, in London, for example, diesel cars are not allowed within the city center or in the main areas in London, is because they want to reduce the emission and clear the basically look at better quality of air or non-polluted air because of the vehicular traffic within inner or central London. So how will petrol and diesel cars ban? This will happen by 2035. It has been reduced from 2040. So a lot of manufacturers are already looking at alternatives to, which is diesel and petrol cars, which is either hybrid or, totally electric cars, in order to reduce the carbon emissions and carbon footprint. So this bit, is something which companies are going to be forced to look into, and this would be because of, say, legislation which the governments would introduce at some stage, and that would make it mandatory for, all types of manufacturers, suppliers to comply with, and that would mean that they will have to look at reducing or, alternatives of basically producing certain products wherein these diesel and petrol cars, for example, will not be allowed. Is that okay? And then towards, I put that activity in just as an example for you to look at, just as an exercise to see how you can offset your carbon footprint or, be carbon neutral by basically looking at taking out, or paying for some activities which will help preserve the environment, and that will help offset the emission that you have done by doing an activity like taking a flight or staying at a hotel or things like that. So any questions on this so far?
No, it's pretty clear.
Okay, good stuff. So I'll upload the updated copy of this presentation with these links of, the websites for you to have a look at. And then what I would suggest is, if you get down to looking at the assignment for this particular unit, which talks about, one second, let me just have a quick look.
Yeah, I think.
So let's look at sustainable development. So in this, there is only one task, which is one essay, which talks about the tasks that deals with the application of theory and concept of sustainable logistics. So you have to look at using an actual company data to support arguments that might be presented. This may take a number of forms, like schematics of supply chain structures, tables, and then purely descriptive material must be kept minimum, and all analysis must be against theory. Okay, the exposition should. So basically, I think here I would suggest is that you could look at the articles, the 2 case studies that have been put, and use that to be able to do the assignment, which is one particular.
I just wanted to ask one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
We don't have to address each individual learning outcome, right? We'll go with the assignment by the report or the article that we select. Right?
That is correct. Yes. So this is a cumulative essay that you have to do, but the essay would be covering all the assessment criteria. So here you're actually using one particular company, like in just one second. So So you're looking at using one particular company here to be able to explain how they are putting the concept of sustainable logistics management from a theoretical point of view into practice. And in order to show that, you have to use maybe the structure, the diagram, or maybe the initiatives that they have done in terms of using schematics, which is, for example, images and pictures which are available maybe through their annual annual journal accounts, or the annual statements of a company, which normally would put some summatives of what they are doing for sustainable development. So if I look at, say, Nestle as an example, just as an example, Nestle. So you would see probably Nestle has a sustainability report as well, which just came up, because I've taught this under corporate social responsibility. So they have an annual report which they produce, and in this particular report, they have something which is a specific report, for sustainability, which will allow you to get, so your company, will have to be, the company that you choose will have to be something which basically has the sustainability report, integrated into it, so that you're able to pick out a lot of pictographics, or the things which are required in order for you to present it in your assignment.
Sure. Okay.
Right, so that would be, one second, let's look at, I've done it in the past because I've looked at the reports of Unilever and Nestle and Kraft. These three FMCG companies definitely have it, and there is details that you can pick out in terms of graphs, tables, how they have done reduction in terms of usage of resources, plantation of trees, making water available in countries wherein obviously there's scarcity of water, by looking at providing facilities like tube wells and other bits, and then reducing these reducing packaging within some of the products that they do. So here we go. This is an example of some of the schematics that they are working on, and it clearly shows what they are helping and doing in terms of the initiatives. These are the initiatives underneath, which basically are highlighted. Say they are supporting, say for example, in this case you would be looking at obviously no poverty, zero hunger. Some of them are social initiatives, but you're looking at the initiatives which are related to logistics and supply chain. So it will be, say, affordable and clean energy. It could be looking at reduction of so sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and recycling, which is this sign, climate action, and obviously reduction of water dependence on fisheries. These are the bits that you could focus on, the points from 11, 12, 13, and 14, which show some sort of working by this large supplier to look at reducing carbon footprint emissions within their supply chain. This is what I would suggest. So the idea here would be to pick out a company wherein you will be able to pick out some of these things from their annual journal report, and then summarize it into an essay by using